I think a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with the Seabees and what they do. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we're naval construction battalion personnel, and there's Group 8 ratings for being steel workers and UTs and electricians and equipment operators and so forth. And we do all the construction for the United States Navy personnel. And I'm also a Navy diver for the Seabees.
Okay. So that's unusual, right? To have those two skill sets in the same person?
It's just kind of recently, we've had Navy divers in the Seabees since World War II, even, but it's only been the last few years it's come into a underwater construction teams for the Seabees.
I see. I see. And can you just talk a little bit about your entry into the military? Were you drafted? Did you come from a long line of military people? How did that happen?
No, my mother passed away when I was 14 years old, and I had a father ever around, and I had a brother that was in the Navy, and a nephew that had joined the Navy, and then I decided it was time for me to go do something, so I joined the United States Navy when I was 16 years old. And people ask me how I did that being 16. You have to have your parents sign for you. And I told my Navy recruiter, mom's passed away and dad's an alcoholic. You might go up north of Spokane and find him and he can sign the papers. And of course, the Navy recruiter never did find my dad. He signed the papers and I went in the Navy. I had a good Navy recruiter
At 16.
at 16.
So you hadn't even finished high school yet.
No, sir. I dropped out of, well, really drop out of high school in the eighth grade. I had a vice president of the school, or vice principal. I mean, uh, my mother was in the hospital with cancer, and myself, my nephew, and my sister were in the house by ourselves, and the neighbor was kind of watching us, and I was the cook, and the other two took care of the house cleaning, and when mom was in the hospital, the uh, vice principal turned us into the authorities for kids living in the house with no adults. And they come down and got my sister and took her to Spokane. And vice principal was sitting at his desk, and I put 150 pounds behind me, and I punched him right in the nose. And I told him, "Where do you put your school and everything else?" And that's when I dropped out of school. And I worked on different farms for a couple of years till I turned 16. And that's when I joined the Navy, and it was the best decision I ever made in my life was to join the Navy and make a career of it. And when I went into the recruiter, I said, "Sign me up for 20 years." And he said, "I can't do it." But I was ready to go for 20 years. And it was the best, like I say, the best decision I ever made. And I got to travel the world.
Now, when you go into the Navy at 16 years old, right? Physically, are you mature like the other boys in boot camp, or
Well, I come from the farm community, a little town called Spangle, Washington, of 242 people. And we worked on the farms and ranches and stuff like that. So I feel that we're more advanced than what the city boys are because we're out in the fields working and milking cows and getting educated. And so consequently, at the age of 16, I weighed 150 pounds. I was a pretty good sized boy. And hay and bucking bales and working like a man. We were pretty fit fellows at that age.
okay, okay. So, what year was this that you went into the Navy?
I went in the Navy in June of 1960, May of 1960.
May of 1960. And where'd they send you for boot camp?
I went to boot camp in San Diego, and then from San Diego, I went to Fort Hueneme. They was going to make a gunner's mate out of me, and I said, "No, I'm going to be a Seabee because that's all I ever do is construction and equipment and stuff like that." And I'd been to trade school in Spokane for welding and everything, so they finally were convinced that I'd be a better Seabee. So from boot camp, I went to Fort Hueneme, and then I went back down to Camp Pendleton and went to 3 weeks of Marine Corps Basic. And
Mm-hmm.
then from there, we went to Guam for 9 months.
And you said you wanted to be a CB. So even at the age of 16, you knew what a CB was?
Yes, sir, I did. I
Hmm.
had a nephew that had joined the Seabees ahead of me, and he's a year older than I am. And he went in and ended up on the East Coast and did his 4 years in one station, and that was it. And of course, I went in the Navy at 16, just a short time after him. And then my other nephew, which is a year younger than I am, he come in and he was also a CB. So
Hmm.
there was right there together in the family. We're all CBs.
Yeah. So when you say construction battalion, can you just give a few examples of the kinds of work that Seabees would do?
When I was in Guam, for instance, I was with MCB 11, that's Mobile Construction Battalion 11. And over there, we were building concrete houses there on Guam and a swimming pool and all. And I was first assigned to the steel yard where I was bending rebar for these concrete houses that we was doing. And I was placing the rebar in those houses all the time I was in Vietnam or in Guam.
Hmm. So you said it was 1960 and you were there for 9 months.
Yes, sir. And then from there, I come back to the States. I was in the States for 30 days, and I went to Yokosuka, Japan, with when I first was there was Public Works, and then they transferred me to ACB1, which is amphibious construction battalions, and of course they do amphibious working on piers and pontoons and all this stuff with the amphibs. And there I was with the steel shop building pontoons and all. And I was there for almost 3 years with the construction battalion. And while I was there, I'll tell you a quick story. Our CB, which is our logo, is a bumblebee, and he's got a machine gun in his hands and then tools in his other two paws. He was in kind of bad shape, and we needed to repair him. So there was a place called Hirohama where they stored a lot of equipment and supplies. And my company commander gave me a property pass for one white tank. That was going to be the body for this new CB. And I went out to Hirohama with a couple of guys, and we picked up this white tank, which actually belonged to the Army, but it was what we needed. And we got to the main gate, and the guards were going to let us out. And one of them said, "Oh, no, that belongs to the Army. It don't belong to you. Go put it back." So we went and put it back. I went back and I told my company chief, I said, "We got caught." And he said, "Chuck," he said, "be here in the morning. We'll go get it." The next morning, Master Chief Ageless and I drove out in a weapons carrier. We went through a great big elephant hut. Master Chief grabbed a smoke bomb, pulled the pin, and threw it out the window. When the smoke started billowing out of the building, we drove over and hooked up the white tank, went out the gate because everybody else was out the fire, they thought. Went back and I had the arms and all the wings and everything else already prepared for that bumblebee. It cost me 2 cartons of cigarettes to have it all painted by a Japanese artist. And then, of course, that bumblebee was put back up in our front of our buildings and everything else. And that year at the CB ball, that bumblebee, I took it up to Yokohama to the club up there. And there was a big traffic circle out in front of the club. And I loaded this on a lowboy with a pontoon, the bumblebee, and all, and drove up to Yokohama, stopped at Public Works to get a crane to set it up on this traffic circle. Well, the crane wasn't there for a while, and when the sergeant said, "Well, let's go in and have lunch," we went in and had lunch was a brandy Alexander, 2 brownies, 3 brownies. The next thing you knew, was pretty well oiled up. And the crane showed up, and the Japanese operator said, "No operator." And I says, "No problem. I'm Watashi Ichiban #1. Never run a Bay City crane in my life." Went out and we started that thing up. Yeah. Put the pontoon up on the center, slung that bumblebee up, and I took that bumblebee and I'm swinging him, and I emptied the club. Everybody out there laughing at me flying that bumblebee. Put him down, getting tied up, and I have to drive that semi back through 5 tunnels from Yokohama to Yokosuka. Got back, and of course it's late in the evening and everybody else is gone. I parked the semi, went in, changed in my uniforms, drove all the way back up to Yokohama. And when I got to the club up there, Lieutenant Norman D. Christie, he grabbed me by the nape of the neck and into the restroom we went. And he said, "I court martial you for what you've done here today." I said, "I didn't do nothing," but that was quite a story. And of course, I ended up with Lieutenant Chris and Master Chief Agus in Vietnam too. But that was a little story about the bumblebee in Japan.
Yeah. So how do you get from Japan to Vietnam, and when?
Okay, let's see, in May, I'll go back here at my notes here real quick. In September of '66, I come back from Japan, but I did a tour in Port Hueneme at the military training facilities, tactics. And I went to NCO school in Camp Pendleton, and I was the only Navy personnel and 80 Marines in that class. And I was really harassed by the Marines, but I made it through it. And then I did my tour at NCO school, and then of course at Seabees Center, Port Hueneme, in military training instructor. And then in April of that next year, MCB 10 come back from July, and I joined MCB 10 then in 1966 and went through diving school that year. And then I went to Vietnam, to Da Nang, Vietnam, and Da Nang, I was in charge of building strand steel buildings throughout the Da Nang area, and also being the diver over there with a crew of divers. Then all the diving was my responsibility. One of the interesting dives I did over there in Vietnam was we had a 10,000-gallon water tank up on the hill, and the flapper valve went bad. So the medical officer made me take a shower. They rubbed me down with alcohol. I jumped into the fresh water tank, handed me my diving gear. I went down and worked on the flapper valve. I come back up and went back down to the lakes afterwards. I had convinced everybody that I urinated in water, but that was always a good joke. But that was a fun dive that day. But I also did some salvage work of cutting the pontoons up. The Marine Corps had swamped a river assembly boat. I had to go out on Benoit River and recover that boat for them. And kind of a story there. When we pulled into the camp there, I hate to say that, but they greeted us in a fancy way with two Viet Cong heads jammed on French boats out there. And we got in there and started diving, and we got the first half of the boat out, and it was getting late at night and raining, and the rudder was rising. And I told the lieutenant, I said, let's cancel this until tomorrow morning. And of course, that night the sergeant said, "Well, come on, go on patrol with us tonight, Chuck." And I said, "No, that foxhole is my foxhole. That's where I'm staying." But they had sent an ensign with me from the battalion, and he told the lieutenant, he said, "We can't be out of the camp after 1800. You have to get a helicopter and fly us back to camp." The lieutenant told our little ensign, he said, "I can't get a helicopter in here to fly my wounded out." He said, "Let alone fly your dumb butt out of here." So we had to spend the night out there in the woods with the Marines that night. And of course, the next day we got the rest of that boat up for them and stuff like that. But I dove every Sunday. I got a half a day off every Sunday. And I would go over to a place called Monkey Mountain, which later became a resort area for everybody for R&R. But there was a beautiful place to dive over there. And I would dive for lobster, and I'd bring the lobster back to the cooks first. They got the first lobsters because that got me a block of ice every day, so I have ice water over there. And if we had extras, you'd go to the Chiefs Club or the Officers Club. I had a weapons carrier assigned to me every Sunday to be able to go and go diving. And an interesting thing there too was across the street from where I was RMK, Morrison Canoes and Construction Company. And they had a couple of guys over there that had diving gear, but they had no way to fill their bottles with air. I had the compressor. And we were rationing 2 cans of beer a day while I was in Vietnam, the old Falstaff. I didn't drink beer at the time, but I sure had good whiskey because the RMK boys kept me with good whiskey for jamming their bottles with air all the time. So there was 4 of us that always went over diving every Sunday. And of course, while I was there in Vietnam, we needed another CB. We didn't have a CB flying in Vietnam. So I would go over across the street to RMK at night, and I was building a CB over there. And we had a diving job going on building a water system for the Air Force Base. And I was injured. I was cutting down some pilings, and I ended up getting my arm cut up pretty bad with a chainsaw. But anyway, I had another young man that worked for me in my group, and his initials were MJB. And I took MGB over to Morrison Kenosha, and nobody knew I was building that CB.
You took him
So
to
I had
where? I'm sorry, where did you take him?
I took him over to RMK, Morrison Kenosha, which is where I was building it, because I needed somebody who could work, because I was crippled up and everything else. We finished putting that CB together, and on Sunday morning they usually had the quarters, and we drove up with that bumblebee in the back of a weapons carrier, and I presented that bumblebee to the commanding officer, and we put that bumblebee up on a post. And of course, the Marines were mad about that bumblebee being flying up. There was no lights on it, so I ended up taking him back down, and I fixed his eyes that blinked with red lights. I had blinking systems in his eyes, because the commanding officer told him, "We're not taking that CB down. That CB is going to stay there." So I ended up with 2 CBs in Vietnam that I had actually built, and I'm kind of proud of having those as our motto, and have them fly in Vietnam also. So that's also in the records in our Mobile Construction Battalion 10 yearbook about that CB in Vietnam flying there just outside of Da Nang. So I left my mark in Da Nang, and I left my mark in Japan.
Hmm. How long were you in Vietnam?
I spent 9 months over there, and just outside of Da Nang at the Air Force Base on Hill 327. And I helped build the exchange and the big amphitheater there. And of course, I built strand steel buildings. And a sad story here, I was building a strand steel at Charlie Med. They were just up the road from us. And that's where they brought the wounded in and did surgeries and stuff like that. One day I went up to work on the building, and the stench and everything is so bad, because they'd bring the bodies in, and the helicopters wouldn't even land. They'd just drop them off, and of course the grave registration was right there. And I had a second class petty officer on my crew that wanted to be a mortician, and every time I turned around, Pittman was over there working with the morticians, helping them. But burning the clothes and burning the bodies and seeing all of it, it wasn't a pleasant thing to be around. And like I say, one day we went up there, and it was really, really, I mean, really unbearable. And I took the crew, and we went back home, and the company commander said, "What are you doing here?" And I says, "We can't work up there today." And they said, "Oh, yeah, we will." I said, "We get in the Jeep, we're going to go for a ride." And I went up there. He said, "No, you guys got the day off." So, I mean, that stench and everything, you'll never get that out of your nose. Yeah, I mean, it's horrible. But there was other things other than that were pretty bad over there that you get involved in.
Mm-hmm. So remind me, when was it that you arrived in Vietnam?
I arrived in Vietnam in February '67.
February 67. What do you remember? What are the first memories you have about just being in Vietnam? Now, you'd been in Guam, you'd been in Japan, so you're no stranger to Asia. But was there anything about Vietnam that stuck with you? First impressions?
First impression, we was flying in C-135, 34, C-130s, and you fly in, and all of a sudden you drops those nose, and you down on the runway. And of course, there's a few snipers there and all too, but you land on that runway, just, I mean, bang, and you're there. And then driving up to our camp and all, the first night I was out on the rock crusher, hard facing the jaws. And I am a perfect target because I got a blue light in my hand. And we got a sniper up on the hill that just welcomed me to Vietnam. So being a young 17, I was 18 years old, 19 years old, I'll get it somewhere there. To hit there and have rounds coming at you the first night is a rude awakening. I mean, from then on, you're scared. I'm not kidding you. That first night was pretty rough.
Yeah. Yeah, it must be. I mean, it must be unusual for somebody 19, 20 years old to be an NCO, with that kind of responsibility.
I can brag a little bit here. Even in boot camp, I was the assistant acting CPO of the company. From there, when I got to Guam, I was in charge of the shipfitters yard, or the steelworkers yard. I've always been in command duty from the time I joined boot camp. It was kind of funny. I was what they call Woodman of the World. It was a group, and it was teaching us marching and fly fishing and hunting and stuff like that. And when in boot camp, they said, "Anybody got any experience in marching?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And that's how I ended up being the acting chief petty officer of the company. And like I say, I've always been in command ever since I joined the service. I've been very fortunate, I guess. So being commander of the steel yard, and then being in charge of the divers, and in charge of my own squad doing the construction work and everything else. And then when I come in the diving world, I was in charge of the diving lock. So it's always been command duty.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier that underwater construction is not such an unusual thing now. Was it unusual then for you to have the two skill sets?
Yes, it was. I am the very first enlisted man that was assigned to a diving billet in the Seabees.
That was assigned to a what?
To a diving billet. I was the first assigned to a diving billet. Now, in World War II and all that, there were Seabee divers working in Hawaii and stuff like with hard hat diving and stuff like that, but they were never assigned as a diver billet.
Mm.
Okay.
So you're the first official diver in the Seabees.
In the Seabees, which was in April of 1970, 1967, April of 1967, when I joined the NCEL. Now, when I come back from Vietnam, what happened was I always knew that there was going to be something going on under construction. So I would sneak off and go over to Naval Civil Engineering Lab at Port Hueneme and got to know the civilians over there, who John Cork was in charge of the GS-14. And I would, for 3 months there, I would sneak off. And I kind of got in trouble a few times from the chief about being not where I was supposed to be. But I got to know those people. We talk about diving and what the responsibility was and stuff like that. I got a set of orders to Adak, Alaska, diving duty. I went over to John and I said, "John, I got orders. I'll be leaving in 2 weeks, going to Adak, Alaska." And John says, "No, you're not going to Adak, Alaska. You're coming here." And I said, "John, I don't think you got that much pull." And he says, "Watch." And the phone started going and the letters started going. And 2 weeks later, I had a set of orders to NCEL diver duty.
Mm.
And so that started my career in a really big way in the diving. I ended up going to first class schools, saturation schools, salvage schools, and all, and running the diving locker there at Port Hueneme.
No, I want to come back to that because I want to hear more about those schools. But before we leave Vietnam, you said you were there for 9 months. Did you spend the entire 9 months in and around Da Nang?
In and around Da Nang, and the Benoit River was my furthest expedition out, helping the Marines get that boat. But my time was all around Da Nang, Red Beach, out at Monkey Mountain, and all that area there.
Mm.
I built a total of 5 strand buildings over there. And interesting there is we didn't have enough concrete finishers to finish concrete and everything else to do these steel buildings. So I convinced the company commander to let me train my boys on setting the forms and finishing concrete and all. And I had a little experience because my dad did a lot of concrete work and all. And so consequently, they said, "Go ahead." So it ended up from then on, I had my own concrete finishers, and we'd pour our own concrete, standard building, and everything else ourselves. And I was working on one for the 3rd Marine Corps. It was a financial facility, had a big safe going in and stuff like that. It was kind of raining one morning. It was pouring concrete, and one of the transmitters was sliding in the ditch. And I didn't want to lose that cement truck, so we only had 5 of them. We couldn't afford to lose another truck. So 3rd Marines were up on the hill from us where we was working. And I went up over the hill and I went into their pool of dozers, and I jumped on a dozer with a P25 on the back of it. And I went out to the main gate with it. I said, hey, Sergeant Peters said I could use this. We got a problem over the hill there. The guard let me out with that dozer. And I went down and hooked onto that transom mix and keep it from tipping over. And I'm dumping the concrete out of it because I wanted to save the truck. And I sent word back to the company commander, who was Norman D. Chris, that I needed him and the wrecker out there because the ensign had shown up there in the Marines. It kind of convinced him that they could save that concrete. And I had to tell that ensign, you make a written direct order, otherwise I'm going to dump this concrete. And I dumped the concrete. And when Lieutenant got there, I told him, I said, that ensign said I had to save that concrete for the Marines. And I had a little spat with him. And the lieutenant went over and told that ensign, he said, you get out of here and don't come back. And backed me up on saving that cement truck. But I did a lot of grand larceny on the outside, but COMSHA on the inside. Being in Seabees, you have to learn how to COMSHA and get things done. So that was the biggest piece of equipment I ever stole. And back in Japan, we were mounting out to go to Vietnam, and I needed a piece of 1-inch plate steel to put on a warping tug. We had 500-pound anchors that went up on these warping tugs to anchor the pontoons when you set them up. And I went down to the Japanese steel yard, which is there on the base at Yokosuka, and I hooked onto a piece of 1-inch plate steel, and I drug it right down the asphalt, and I welded it in place. And the next day, O and I, officer and intelligence, were around talking about that piece of steel that was stolen from those iron workers. Of course, we paid them back, but I've been known to do a couple things like that now and then when I have to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you remember about, when your time drew short, you were getting ready to leave Vietnam? Did that change do you feel like you were different in terms of your attitude or how you approached the job?
Well, here again, remember, I got injured on the diving tunnel we was doing for the Air Force Base. My right arm was cut pretty bad, and I couldn't use it at all. And I was running around there the last about 2 months, not knowing what I was going to do or anything else. They wanted to send me to. I said, no, I'm going to stay here because we had a good medical facility. And the guys down at the shop made me a sling for my wrist and everything else. And I finally went into the executive officer and I said, Commander Weir, I said, why don't you let me take over special services? And there gives me something to do. I can pass out equipment on Sundays or do stuff. So I went down, and there was an E7 chief petty officer who had special services, and he was invited to go back to the Delta Company, and I took over special services. So it was a pretty easy time for me in Vietnam. There was a lot of things I didn't like that went on over there, stealing from us and stuff like that. But I was different in the aspect is it made you grow up. You knew what war was about. You've seen a lot of death and a lot of destruction. So yeah, it changed your life. It makes you think. I lost too many friends over there.
Yeah. So let's see, where are we now? It's 68 when you return from Vietnam?
No, 67. I returned back in February, actually February of 67 was when I turned back. And then in April is when I started going with NCEL.
Got it. So what is saturation school? What does that mean?
Saturation is where you go down into a depth and you stay there for more than a period of time where you don't have decompression. You can stay there for 2-3 days or a week and you're saturated out. My longest dive was 300 feet for 9 days from the time I entered the chamber until I got out when I went to school. I'm only one of 4 Seabees at the time that had ever went through saturation school. Okay? And I was at 300 feet, and we were guinea pigs doing mixed gas studies. And they put a foreign gas to me, and I passed out at 300 feet. And today it's top secret. They will never tell you what kind of gas they put on me because we was testing to see if there was other gas we could use other than helium and oxygen. And I have no idea what the gas was, and I can never find out.
Hmm. So I'm assuming that's where the name comes from. Saturation refers to the gas, blood
Right.
gases.
Right. See, when you go down and stay at a depth for a number of time, like the Sea Lab program, you crawl into what's called a PTS transfer capsule. You're lowered down to your depth. You work. You crawl back in the capsule. They bring you up. You lock back on the chambers, and you live in the chamber. And you stay saturated for duration, and then you start your decompression. And it depends on how deep you are, how long it takes you to decompress and to get back up to surface.
Hmm. What are some of the physical effects of being saturated?
We're finding out now that it affects your body in several different ways, especially joints has been a bad thing. I've had both of my knees replaced now and because of the diving. And I feel also that when I was a guinea pig with this gases and everything else, that's probably some of the reason why my lungs are the way they are now. I have COPD awful bad, and I think that a lot of that gas was part of that. The other thing is hearing. You're always punching your eardrums and pressure, and so consequently, 90% of us all here end up with hearing aids before we get out of the diving because of trying to equalize the pressure on it there. So there's lots of side effects that are coming up, and we're finding out about saturation diving too. But we learn how to live with it too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you said once you were in the Navy, you made a career out of it. How long did you stay in?
I did over 12, almost 13 years in when I was injured on a dive in San Diego and was put out with 100% disability.
So 13 years total in the Navy?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. What'd you
I
do after
went,
that? I mean, you got a unique skill set, right? I mean, not too many guys can do what you do.
you know, I got hundreds of stories about the diving and stuff that I've worked on with the diving that I did in the Navy, the Sea Lab program, all of this research and development work that I did at NCEL and then sitting under all construction teams and all that noise. So there's a lot to talk about in the diving world that things that I've developed back 50 years ago, they're still used today. And all I went to all these schools and all this noise to become a master diver in the Navy. And unfortunately, I was in the D7 and I couldn't become a master diver. But I've been recommended for meritorious advancement way back when. So there's a lot of stories to talk about here before I talk about what I did after the service.
Okay.
I was at NCL there until I went to first class school in March of '68. I went to saturation school in May of '69. And then in '69, October '69, I took a crew of divers and a lieutenant back to Davisville, Rhode Island to set up a first underwater construction team called UTCT-1. And the lieutenant was assigned to St. Croix, Virgin Islands to do Operation Tektite. And that left me in command duty in Davisville, Rhode Island with a team. And I brought the team back to California, went through blasting school, a very tight blasting school. We went back to Davisville, Rhode Island, and was prepared to do a classified job in the Azores at the time. But we also went down to Homestead Air Force Base. I took the crew down there and 5 civilians out of New York who imploded buildings. All this is in my book. But we went to Homestead Air Force Base for advanced blasting training and had a lot of fun down there and come back from there. And then I had to go over to Newport, Rhode Island and do a blasting job on base, which EOD and the other people wouldn't even touch. And we did that blasting job. And in January 1970, we had a storm, sunk 2 Amic pontoons, and we had to salvage those in the wintertime and dive through the ice and all. And military guys will understand. I'm out at quarters, standing in an officer's billet, and I'm E6. And consequently, E7s and the officers were pretty unsettled about this E6 out there filling an officer's billet. So the Commodore said, Chuck, just keep your divers in your diver locker, and called in your muster reports from there. So it ended up that the admiral called me one day and said, Chuck, he said, we got a problem. And I said, yeah, I know. I said, I'm only E6. I'm pulling all this command duty and making all these decisions and taking crews to Florida and back to California and planning all this stuff and all. And he said, would you mind swapping billets with Master Chief Miller out in San Diego? And I said, Admiral, I'll do it for 2 years, but I want to be back with the team in 2 years. And he says, no problem. So I was transferred out to DSS PTO, that's Deep Submerged Systems Projects. And when I got there, the first thing the Commodore said, Chuck, he said, you're a builder, you know how to build things. Go out there and build a handball court for us, indoor handball court for us. So I went out back to the buildings. I built an indoor handball court for him. And Master Diver Hill had already been up to Port Hueneme, California. We were working under my command up there, and along with the other Sea Lab divers and stuff like doing the construction project for Sea Lab. Now I'm back down to San Diego under their command. Well, Marcus Hill, he didn't quite like me because I had been around, I think, too much. But anyway, I did some other work on other projects and did a manifold system and all as the gas king and all. So we was out doing some dives with mixed gas quals that we had to do. And he put me down with another diver and he put us into kelp, and he run us around the kelp. And I mean, we were really tangled up in kelp, and they're trying to pull us out of there with our lifelines. And he yanked on us and injured my back that day. But anyway, I come in the next day and I told him, I said, Marcus, I said, yesterday when you guys were trying to get us out of that kelp, I said, you guys hurt me pretty bad. But I worked for almost a year, hurting pretty bad with that daggone back. Finally, we was building classrooms for the Mark V system, and Captain Langringer caught me getting my back kind of popped, and so I had to go back to work. And he took me in a car and over to Balboa Naval Hospital, and that's when he operated on me. And I was in hospital for 30 days. I come back after 30 days, and I jumped 4 feet off of pier down onto a float checking the boats one night when I had duty. And it took me a while to get back up again. The next day, by 11 o'clock, I couldn't urinate. And I went up to Captain Langlever and I told him I couldn't urinate and what I did. And he finally got me catheterized. And he here again, his private car out to Balboa Naval Hospital. And Captain Shorn was the surgeon. And they took me down and done a special studies MR on my back and put me in the hospital that night. And come in the next day and he said, I'm sorry, Chuck. He said, but I'm going to write a board on you. You're done. You can't dive anymore. We're going to put you out of the Navy. That was one of the hardest days of my life when I was told that I lost my Navy career, lost my diving career and all. And when the board come back and Captain walked in with the board and he said, here, sign this. I said, I'm not going to sign that yet. And it ended up that I got 60% disability right off the bat for the MEM guys. So to go ahead and cut a little short here, I got out of the Navy and 5 years was pretty rough. I mean, a lot of pain and the VA hospitals and Valium and alcohol and all. There was a couple of times they didn't know whether to call an ambulance or call them a morgue or what, because I was pretty bad shape with Valium and alcohol. And 5 years later, I found a civilian doctor to operate on me, and they did surgery on me, and I went back to school then and got my architectural degree in drafting, and then I went to got my general contractor's license and set up under a construction company in San Diego for about 5 years, and then I sold that and went to Alaska. Well, I traveled for 3 years. just traveling all over the place with RV, and I decided to go to Alaska to go fishing, and that was might have been a mistake because when you go to Alaska as a young man, I was only about 29 years old, hunting and fishing and the scenery and the life up there. I ended up buying property and we built a campground. So there goes 20 years of my life running a campground in Alaska.
Where in Alaska did you say that was?
I was down in a little village called Ninilchik. I'm south of Anchorage, between Anchorage and Homer, Alaska, on the Kenai Peninsula, and that's where we spent 20 years there. And here again, there's a million stories about campground life and taking kids out fishing I could go on for hours about stories out there also.
Chuck, let me ask you a question. While you're, 17, 18, 19 years old in the Navy and you're over in the Pacific and the South China Sea, do you have any idea what's going on with your siblings?
The first 5 years that I was in, they knew that I was in the Navy, but I had no contact with anybody for 5 years of my family. I had a younger sister, an older sister, and a brother still alive. And like I say, my dad died while I was in the service also. Uh, so I like I say, I just kind of left home because I was kind of drinking too much and running with the guys and all, and I didn't have a chance to have anything being my dad being an alcoholic, mother being passed away, and there was just nothing there for me. So uh, the Navy became my family, and I went in with the attitude 20 years and I volunteered for a lot of things because that was my life. Uh, and I had the opportunity to see a lot. I got Japan. I got down into Mindoro, the Philippine Islands, and Okinawa, Midway, Wake, Guam. I got to see a lot and do a lot of things. A lot of these people never get to see that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. What did you ever reconnect with your siblings?
I did after it was but I got home from Japan and I went and seen my sister and I went back and seen my grandparents and all. And it wasn't until oh gosh after I got out of the Navy before my brother and I really got to do anything because I was working on a ranch and mom was in the hospital and I see my brother drive by and he wouldn't even pick me up and take me up to see mom. And the gentleman that I was working for at the time had just bought a brand new 57, that was a 57 Chevy pickup. And I stole that pickup one Sunday and I drove it to Spokane. I'm only 14 years old. I got an agricultural permit. And 10 years later, Dutch said, Chuck, I need to talk to you about something. I said, what's that? He said, the day you stole my pickup. He knew it, but he knew where I went. He knew I went to see mom. Of course, that was the last time I seen my mother-in-law. But my brother and we wouldn't speak for years until after I got out of the service. And then we finally kind of buried the hatchet a little bit. And of course, he's 86 years old now, and I'm 80 years old. So we better bury it then because time is going to run out here real quick. And then, of course, I got two sisters that we see one another once in a blue moon. They're up in Washington State, and I'm down here, beautiful Cedar City, Utah.
Yeah.
And back here real quick, the gentleman we did here with me, Jerry Van Warren, Jerry and I were together in San Diego at DSSPTO, and he was this bubblehead, and he was on the Sperry. We never knew one another down there, but we knew other people, and all in communication down there. And here 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I went to a church, and here's Jerry in there. We got to talk a little bit. And of course, we know now that we knew one another down there, and we've been friends for what 11 years now, Jerry, something like that. And of course, now that I'm out and everything else up here, we've probably jumped ahead here, but we've set up the first uh, Southern Utah Veterans Association. And Jerry's my vice president. I'm president. We got a couple other guys in the group too, so we got more stories there yet.
Yeah. So you and Jerry started this organization?
Yes, we did. Uh,
And
I started,
how long ago was that? And what was it that drew you toward just doing work with veterans?
well, I was recommended for a meritorious advancement way back in San Diego at DSSPTO. And I had taken the chief's exam 5 different times. And because of Vietnam and the instant petty officers, I couldn't be advanced because there was no billet for me. And the people at DSSPTO had recommended me for meritorious advancement. Well, after being out of the service for 50 years, and a diver, I love the water. I kid you not. I love that ocean. Drop back a few years, we, as a kid, I was about 12 years old, we went salmon fishing at Westport, and I got so seasick out there, I told the captain, you call the Coast Guard, tell them I'm dying. So I never thought I'd ever be involved in the open. But after I got and become a diver, I love diving. I love that ocean. I mean, that is nothing but beauty. And people would never get to see what I got to see and do in the water. And consequently, I had to stay away from the divers. And I did for a number of years. And a few years ago, I thought, you know what? I need to go see what the divers are doing. So I went to Fort Wayne and I went to the diving locker that I built. And I walked in, there was nobody there. So I made myself to home. I just started walking through the diver locker and seeing what they'd changed and what they'd added and stuff like that. And at the time, I was dragging an oxygen bottle and I was in a walker. And I started to walk out, and this chief walked in the front door and he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'd like to talk to somebody that works here." He says, "I'm the master diver here." And he kind of stepped back and he looked at me and he says, "Is your name Waddell?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "We've been looking for you for a long time." He said, "Come with me." So
Now,
we
how did
went
he
in.
wait? Why? What made him say that? What made him say, "Is your name Waddell"?
Well, because there was a lot of history. They didn't have any history about the diving. Now we're talking at that time probably 40 years. Okay, that they didn't have anything, and they had a whole bunch of pictures, and nobody knew what it was all about. So I sat there for a couple of hours going through pictures and showing him what it was, and he's writing down all the information on it and everything else. And he said, one of the questions, "You people had a pickup truck?" "Yeah, we did." And so I showed him a picture of it. I had it on my phone, and they just heard about it. They'd never seen it, and there was a lot of that kind of stuff that they didn't know. And he said, "We need to go over to Team Two, Underwater Construction Team Two, tomorrow morning." And I said, "Fine, we'll go over. I'd like to see the equipment they got." No. So we get over there, and we start walking around with the commanding officer and looking at all this equipment and all this noise and everything else. We ended up in the classroom with 42 divers sitting there. And the commanding officer says a few words, and he introduced me, and I said, "Whoa, I'm not prepared for this." 45 minutes later, and them guys still sitting on the edge of their chairs, I had a lot of fun talking history to these people. And they said, "Chuck, you need to write a book." And I said, "I'm an old 8th grade dropout." And I says, "I got my high school education after I got out of the service. I graduated from high school in 1979. And I told myself I don't need to write a book. But here, 3 years ago now, yeah, 3 years ago, when I sold the campground, I had flown to Alaska to do it. And I passed out on the airplane, and I scared the dickens out of my wife and everybody else on the plane. And I spent some time. I woke up in the emergency room, and I've been dehydrated and pneumonia. And but anyway, I sold the campground, and I come back down and built my home here in Cedar City. And then I started getting more involved with the divers at home. And in my book, there's the story about me and the meritorious advancement to chief petty officer. Well, the guys up there, well, let me back up here a little bit. When I come down here, I from the plane from selling my campground, I ended up both my knees locked up on me, and it was a pretty rough time here. They put me in VA hospital. Well, it was a hospital here in San Diego, Cedar City first. Jerry testified to this. I was a screaming idiot and pain and everything else in a nursing home. And then I went up to Salt Lake City VA hospital. I spent 9 days there, never got a bath or a bed change at all. They hauled me out of there and took me down to Ivy Ivan, which is just a suburb of St. George. They put me in the military hospital there. I spent from May until August in there with my legs locked up and waiting for some surgery. Lost 100 pounds. And they finally operated on my back the 17th of August. And then in September, they operated on my first knee. And then the next February, they operated on my next knee. And I had already had bladder cancer and had beat it. But I ended up coming down with colon cancer. And I went down to St. George and they operated on me for cancer and hooked me all back up and everything else. And I was in there 10 days. And I come home and I got home and I wasn't home an hour and septic poison started bellowing out of my stomach and everything else. What a mess. But anyway, the ambulance got there, took me down to unload me in Cedar City and then turned around and load me up and heading for St. George. And on the way down to St. George, that nice warm white light come on and I got to talk to the Lord and I told him, I says, everything's okay. I've told my wife goodbye. I know I'm on my last journey and everything's okay. And I woke up in intensive care. 10 days later, I realized that the Lord left me here for a reason, to write that book, to help people with colostomies and to help the veterans and what I'm doing now. So I got cured up from all this stuff and I went back up and the book had come out and the guys at the diver locker got the paperwork that recommended me for the meritorious advancement to chief petty officer. And they took that and they run to Washington and they got it all approved and was signed by the senior chief petty officer of the United States Navy. And in Fort Wayne, California, they had me come back and I did a week's initiation because the Navy still initiates their chief petty officers, their E7s. So I went through a week's initiation and then we had the ceremony on the parade ground and it cost me $1,000 for a dress uniform and my khaki uniform. And when they piped me across there from my wife pinning me and my hat put on me and all this noise, about 500 people just erupted. And one of the happiest days of my life was getting that chief's hat put on me. And I come back to Cedar City and I went to different organizations and they were said that I was radical and we were going to have any beer in any of their sessions and not to be involved in it. So I went to Jerry here and I said, Jerry, we need to form association. And that's how we started the association. It was Jerry and I and another diver was involved in it and another Seabees was involved in getting it into the corporation. And that's how we formed the LLC, Southern Utah Veterans Association. Now that we did that a year ago, last July, was when we got our 5013C. And Jerry and I and the group have moved a mountain, as far as I'm concerned, of getting things done for veterans here in Cedar City and St. George. And it's an ongoing mission that we have here. And I'm fully dedicated to getting everything done here. We want to build a building to house artwork, ceramics and sewing and woodwork and artwork and a restaurant and a bakery in our building. And as you know, we've contacted your boss about getting the Vietnam War wall built right here in Cedar City. And we've also been awarded a cemetery, national cemetery here in Cedar City, but they put it on a rock pile and we're trying to get that moved and put it all in one big compound that we're building here in Cedar City.
Mm-hmm. How many members do you have in your association?
I hate to say that. Right now it's 20.
Yeah, right now we've got about 20 and the phase that we're in, the phase is
I can't, this audio is not going to be usable if Jerry's across the room. I also Jerry, if you're going to join the interview, I need you to introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Gerald Van Iwarden and I reside here in Cedar City. I am the pastor of a church called Westview Christian Center. I've done that since 1996. And I love this community. And so I met Chuck.
Now, Jerry, you're a military veteran as well?
Yes, I am.
What branch?
U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
And I was on nuclear submarines, and I was a reactor operator supervisor on nuke boats, and so also on regular boats. And I spent time in Vietnam, but actually in the war zone. And I think it totaled 27 and a half minutes so that we could get tax-free pay. So most of our activities were up in the Northern Pacific. So I was on a nuke boat that was built, and I was on the launch crew, I was on the commissioning crew, and everything else. So
yeah. So you were talking about the association and how the membership has grown in the first year.
Yeah, we've not so much focused on gathering numbers of members, but the main thing that we've done is we have been in contact with civic organizations, and we have done presentations before the Rotary Club, which is very influential here. We have also done it in front of the Iron County Commission, and we're also well known by this Cedar City Council, as well as their administration and a whole lot of other groups. So we're continuing to expand the awareness, and then what we want to do as the Southern Utah Veterans Association. And so right now, we've got conceptual plans being drawn on 2 pieces of property so that we can demonstrate what it is that we want to do.
And what is your vision for the association? 5 years, 10 years down the road, what would you like it to be?
Well, 5 years down the road, we want to be well on our way to building the art center so that veterans can experience relief from PTSD by doing arts. There's a similar organization in Vista, California called vetarts.org, and they've offered to help us get started with that. But we already have people have donated equipment for woodworking, for sewing, for a whole host of things. And we feel that by taking veterans out of isolation that are suffering with PTSD, and isolation is the worst thing, and then getting them back into activities or just social settings, and being able to then also get their medical and psychological help, that we will enable them to live the lives that they should be living. So we want to be up and running in 5 years. We understand that we may have some hiccups along the way, of course, with funding, et cetera, but we are a 501c3, and we have a good board of directors. I think all of them are veterans, and so we're just gaining notoriety in a lot of places, and we have connections with the state legislature, as well as the governor, and others are on board with this type of effort because we're in a really rural area. We're about 3.5 hours south of Salt Lake, and we're about 3.5 hours north of Las Vegas. So we're now starting to visit a lot of the organizations in St. George area, and we've gotten a great response from them. And because we have put a lot of concern and care into making a plan that's doable. So that's very important for us. Don't just talk about it, get it going. We actually had a float in the July 4th parade, which is a big deal here. And we actually won a prize. And we had a drop deck trailer for a semi truck, and we had people actually making like they were doing rock work. And then also we had a young guy on a lathe, and he was turning the wood while we proceeded down the parade route. Nice. We also had a Jeep up on the upper deck from the 1940s, and that had been restored. So we just had a great presence, and it
I'm
was
assuming
really,
that the construction of that float was done underwater, right? And this,
yeah, no, yeah, no, actually here, there's not that much water to do anything under. So
right,
it's
right,
going to get saturated. It's going to get by blown dust. So
right, exactly, exactly. Well, tell me a little bit more about this wall project that you guys are kicking off here.
well, we feel that one of the things that we need to do here in southern Utah, this is a great veteran-friendly community. Actually, all of southern Utah is. We very much love our nation, and we very much honor those that have served and are serving. You can check out some of the history from even in the Korean War. Some of the field artillery here was active in the Korean War at a Battle of Kapyong. And we have built a veterans um, park, and we have monuments in there from Operation Iraqi Freedom. We have them from the Korean War with a bronze sculpture. We have World War II represented by marble cenotaphs and plaques listing all the names of people that served. Vietnam War has its own memorial as well, and so does World War I. So the city will give you the land to do that type of thing. And then we funded it and built it. So what we're interested in doing is building something that will have impact, because I have friends that I grew up with and from elementary school on, whose names are on the wall. And so we want to be able to have a place for people like from Las Vegas or from St. George to come up and be able to see the wall, and be able to reflect on the price that's paid so that we could have our freedom.
Sure, sure. Well, I'm sure this has occurred to you guys already, but Chuck's cousin in Angel Fire, New Mexico, I believe has just broken ground on building a
Yes,
wall
yeah,
there. So,
yeah.
that might be somebody you guys could consult with. I mean, he's probably learning some lessons that would be valuable to you along the way.
Yeah. Well, we get support from anywhere and anywhere. We're not go it alone guys.
Mhm.
And so all of these things are very important to us. And for instance, I was not in country in Vietnam, but I did have a close friend that went down whenever the USS Scorpion went down in 1968. And so these type of losses are very, as well as my childhood friends whose names are on the wall, because they were Marines and got killed in Nam. So this is very important for me and for, I believe, for the country and for our area to centralize a place for sacred memories as well as reflections on what we do as a country.
Mhm.
Also, Mike, I know that there's another wall, the full size in Missouri. Okay. And that's how I found out about it, was with that wall being built back there. But the other thing to remember is we're on Interstate 15, which is goes north and south from border to border. So you got hundreds of people now who will have the opportunity to see the wall. They can't afford to go to Washington to see it, but traveling Interstate 15, they'll be able to stop and see this wall. And I still feel the hurt from Vietnam being called a baby killer and my house being stolen from me when I was in Vietnam. So I have a lot of hurt, but I want the veterans to be honored, and the only way you can honor these people is get that wall built here where they can see the wall and remember the guys that give 58 of them give their all to what we saved for this country, and it's
Yeah.
going to give them an opportunity to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
58,000. Do you
yeah,
know,
58,000.
uh, do you have any sense? I haven't done the research. I guess I should have. Do you have any sense for how many of the 58,000 are from Utah or from southern Utah?
Well, I did at one time when we were doing the Vietnam War Memorial over there as part of the Rotary Centennial Veterans Park, but I don't have that figure in mind now. I
Yeah,
don't
me neither.
know.
I mean, it's a pretty rural, like you said, it's not a densely populated area, so I wouldn't
No,
imagine.
it's not. But however, a larger percent of the population is more freedom oriented and service oriented than some areas of the country.
Sure.
Because, like Chuck was saying, getting spit upon and stuff like that. Being on submarines, we would come and go at different weird times, and we could always change clothes and go off in civilian clothes. But I did know people there in around 1969 to 71 that were attacked by these people in those ways that just degraded them for their experience when they landed at Lindbergh Field in San Diego.
Sure. Sure. How far along is the wall project at this point? Is it?
Well, the wall project is part of the whole Veterans Center project. So we're just now finishing up with conceptual plans, and so that we can do presentations that will give more credibility to the effort going on. And then, of course, we've already selected a site on 2 possible pieces of property for the wall. And then as we get a little bit further and be able to gain access to the land, then we'll be moving forward more significantly with the wall.
Mm-hmm. I imagine you have to do a fair amount of fundraising.
Yes,
Yeah.
quite a bit. But I think that having seen the response of the community so far, we have one foundation that has selected us for an annual distribution. And we also have local businesses that have donated a large amount of goods, either to give away, to sell, to donate, or whatever. So there's tons of support and promises from contractors that whenever we get ready to build this thing, like an HVAC contractor, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, has already volunteered to put in the systems at no charge in the building. So that's going to be about 20,000 or so square feet. So in kind of a U shape. So that's a significant donation. And then we also have a lot of other entities that have donated and will donate.
Got it. Well, we are we got about 8 minutes left, and if it's okay, I'd kind of like to get back to the book. I want to make sure that I get a few questions about the book into the interview. So thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So Chuck, first of all, I'm just curious. It seems, the title of your book is ironic. Where did that come from?
When I wrote the book, I couldn't figure out a name for this book. And I called up the diver locker and I said, guys, you got me to write this book. Now you got to name this book. And a couple days later, I got a call from a warrant officer, and he says, "Farm boy can't swim." And I laughed. And I said, what a perfect name for a book, as Farm Boy Can't Swim, because we did a lot of swimming. So it was kind of a joke. And on the front of the book, there's a picture of a diver out in the water here. I hear. And that's actually a picture of me, but that's an old hard hat dress. And you'd drown in that thing if you're not in the water like that. But the editor put it up there as kind of a joke. So all the old divers, they'll know that it was a joke, that picture of me out there in that hard hat suit.
Yeah. And how long ago did you publish the book?
It's been out now for about 2 years.
2 years. And if people wanted to find it, where would you send them?
Amazon.
Amazon.
And one thing I want to do, Michael, right now is everybody that in the military that has wrote books, and you're getting a lot of these guys that have wrote books. Yep. One thing that we want to do in our building here, we'll have a store, and I want all of those guys that have wrote a book is to contact us and give us their book, so if we can sell their books for them out of our facility. because they're stories that people need to read. And these guys have taken the time to write these stories. They need to read the stories of what we went through as life and in a war zone and all. And I think if it was easy access for them people when they walk in and see it, they'd pick it up and read it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. And I think, it's also important just to recognize that, I mean, for most of the people I talk to who've written books, the books aren't just about Vietnam, right? That's an important chapter, but the contributions that these men and women have made since Vietnam is equally important.
Oh, yes. Yes. And there's a lot of them that have done a lot of good. But the people need to read about this and keep that history going.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you about, Chuck, that you wish I had?
No, I think you've done a very good job, Michael. The only thing I will tell you, tunnel of towers are really helping these people get housing and stuff like that. But when I was in Vietnam in July, the real estate company that I bought my house from in Oxnard, California, they used a quitclaim deed and signed it and stole my house. And I come home from Vietnam on emergency leave. I lost my house. I lost all my equity. I never got my house back because I couldn't even get a lawyer.
How were they able to do that?
When I bought my house, I signed a quitclaim deed blank and didn't know it. And they used it in July. What really hung them was I was in Vietnam in July when they signed that. They took that signed document and filed it and took my house away from me. But I come home to get it back, and I couldn't get a lawyer to help me. And consequently, I lost that house. I lost all the equity. They moved my wife out of there, and she moved into an apartment house.
Your wife was living in the house at the time?
My wife was living in the house. They forced her out of the house, and she moved into a rented apartment. And I couldn't get anybody to help me. That's how bad it was back in them days. You can't realize.
You couldn't get anyone to help you. You couldn't get a lawyer to help you, you believe, because of your service in Vietnam?
That's in fact exactly right. You couldn't get anybody to help you. I went back to Vietnam. I was there for 7 days. I went back to Vietnam and lost my house. Okay? And that was one of the things that really hurt me more about it in Vietnam is you got spit on when you come in, you got tormented and you lost your house and nobody helps you. But fortunately, T42 is doing a lot now to help these people that have been injured and lost and everything else. And I really recommend that highly for those people there. Wounded Warriors is a different program. I really appreciate it. I wanted to say one more thing here. The other day, Jerry and I were kind of ratting around here a little bit. Told me a little story that I really thought was something. There was 3 bombers, B-1 bombers.
B-52s.
B-52s. And their crews were saved by submariners. And I never knew that until we were sitting here talking about it one day. Here, Jerry, I'll tell you about it quick like.
Yeah, serving on nuclear submarines during the Vietnam conflict and shortly thereafter, there were still a lot of B-52s. After my last patrol overseas ended in June of '69. That was a 9-month patrol. And out of the 9 months, we were in port for 27 days. So we used to do a lot of heavy time while they were running bombers from Anderson and Guam, and they were bombing North Vietnam. And so over that time, there were 3 bomb B-52s that had gotten shot up and made it out into the ocean in the South China Sea and ultimately had to ditch. And the only Navy vessels in the area were nuclear submarines, which are perfectly round and not really made for surface travel. And I know of 2 of them. One of them is the USS Barb, and I forgot the name of the other one, but they rescued on different occasions. They rescued the crews of the B-52s that they could get. And the seas were in like 10 to 12 foot seas. Oh, and yeah, so it's scary being on the deck of a submarine, even in port. And so there's some stories about that You can probably find out, and actually a good contact for you might be the Naval Submarine League, which has offices in DC area, and they're all a bunch of great submariners, and they can probably tell you about the incidents, as well as the U.S. Naval Institute and the Naval History Branch. They can actually get in with some of the guys that have served on the riverine patrols on the swift boats, and a whole lot of other stuff that'll enhance your collection of stories from Vietnam. And then there's a lot of them too that served on the gun line, which is destroyers and cruisers off of Vietnam shelling. And so they would call in fire support, and so the ships were able to hit them. And actually, the USS Long Beach, a nuclear-powered cruiser, did receive a citation for having shot down, I think, 2 North Vietnamese MiGs from offshore over North Vietnam. Wow. And so I know the guy's senior chief and a first-class machinist mate were on that Long Beach and received the awards that the Long Beach got. So there's a lot of stories out there that from different branches, including from Air Force. Sure. Like there was a flight engineer on C-130s that lives here in Cedar, and he was stationed at places and did airdrops at Quai Son and a whole bunch of places like that. So there's a pretty broad base of people.
The problem we have is not finding stories. The problem we have is collecting them fast enough, right?
I know.
I mean, your generation is
it's fading fast.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the challenge we have is, can we collect them quick enough? But there's so many great stories. Although I have to say it's kind of funny to imagine an Air Force pilot, a bomber pilot, bobbing around in 10 to 12 foot seas. He's probably not prepared for that.
No. And even dragging them aboard is really tough because the fast attack submarines are 7/8 submerged when they're sitting fully on the surface. And so that slimy, slippery steel, it took a lot of skill to maneuver it because those boats have a single screw. They don't have 2 screws.
Right.
And so you just can't back down, and as maneuvering would require in that kind of territory. And so it's just really quite a story. And if you've ever been on those or seen them, then you know what they endure. Now, getting into my area, we did have to surface one time and cut off nets outside of the Sea of Japan because we went through somebody's trawler net. And we had to surface at night and get down on deck and cut it off with a torch. So, I mean, you just got all this stuff that people don't realize that at any time, you're in hazardous places, not just in Nam itself, but anything conducted with national defense.